Yes, instant Quaker oatmeal with dates and brown sugar sweetening. This is our new delight.
Then I need my breakfast, so I eat breakfast squares.
There was a time when breakfast wasn't just the first meal of the day. It was the warm heartbeat of the home. We flipped through Betty Crocker pages like they were treasure maps, serving recipes that felt like love on a plate. We passed these breakfasts down like heirlooms. So what happened? Why did we stop making them? Eggs a la Goldenrod. If you grew up with a Betty Crocker cookbook in the kitchen drawer, you probably remember the elegance of eggs a la Goldenrod. Beyond ordinary eggs on toast, this was pure morning performance. First, you'd hard-boil the eggs, separating the sunny yolks from the snow-white whites. The whites got chopped and folded into a velvety white sauce, spooned generously over crisp toast until every inch was covered. And then came the magic touch. The yolks, pressed through a sieve or crumbled finely, sprinkled like golden confetti across the top. The spoon tapped the toast, soft scrape, then a snowfall of yolk. The dish was as much about presentation as it was about flavor, mild, creamy, comforting, with just enough salt and pepper to make you linger over each bite. Classic meatloaf. Yes, meatloaf for breakfast, because in the Betty Crocker era, yesterday's supper didn't just disappear into the fridge. It came back in slices, warmed in the skillet, maybe with a fried egg on top, or pressed between thick slices of bread for a hearty morning sandwich. Classic meatloaf was dependable, the kind of dish that stretched a pound of ground beef into a week's worth of meals. In the 50s and 60s, families leaned on it the way we lean on coffee. It was grounding, familiar, and affordable. Mid-century cookbooks often featured simple versions: breadcrumbs, eggs, onions, a little ketchup or tomato sauce for moisture, baked until the top had that mahogany crust you could tap with a fork. Macaroni and cheese, old school, forget the blue box. Betty Crocker era macaroni and cheese was a love letter to baked comfort. Beyond powdered cheese over pasta, it was about layering elbow macaroni with real shredded cheddar, drenching it in a homemade white sauce, and baking it until the top was bubbly and browned in spots. If you were lucky, your mother would slip some breadcrumbs on top, so every bite had a little crunch before you hit the creamy middle. And yes, mac and cheese for breakfast wasn't strange at all. That cheddar and toaster heat smell traveled down the hallway like a bell. Leftovers were often served hot from the skillet in the morning, sometimes with a side of sliced tomatoes or a glass of milk. In the post-war years, this was a dish that felt like abundance. Creamed chipped beef on toast. There's something almost rebellious about how much comfort this wartime dish still holds. Creamed chipped beef on toast was born from ration books and necessity, yet it somehow tasted like home. Paper-thin slices of dried beef, frugal but flavorful, were torn into ribbons and folded into a silky peppered cream sauce. Then came the toast, sturdy, lightly buttered, ready to catch every drop. Mess halls called it SOS. The home version softened into pure comfort. Mothers in the 40s and 50s knew that a little dried beef could stretch into something that felt downright indulgent when served this way. Jolly Breakfast Ring. More centerpiece than side, the Jolly Breakfast Ring was a cake-like ring baked to golden perfection, its center crowned with jewel-bright cherries that seemed to glow in the morning sun. The smell alone was a wake-up call, sweet, buttery, a little citrusy. The BC pamphlets showcased it to be as beautiful as it was delicious, the kind of dish you could proudly serve when company stayed the night. Each slice had that soft crumb, the occasional pop of fruit, and a glaze that caught the light just so. Fruit float with sherbet. Here's one that felt more like a party than breakfast. Picture it, a tall glass or bowl filled with slices of banana, orange segments, maybe a little crushed pineapple, topped off with ginger ale so the bubbles danced around the fruit. Ginger ale ticked against the glass, bubbles worrying the sherbet. Then, the grand finale, a scoop of rainbow sherbet gently dropped on top, slowly melting into a fizzy, frothy crown. This was the kind of thing a mom might make on a birthday morning or when she wanted to turn an ordinary Saturday into something special. It was bright, cheerful, and just the right mix of tangy and sweet. Sure, it wasn't health food, but it was joy food. Candle salad. On the playful end, candle salad was pure spectacle. A bed of crisp lettuce, a round of pineapple, a peeled banana standing tall in the center, and a cherry perched on top, all drizzled with a little mayonnaise or whipped cream. Yes, you heard that right. Mayo at breakfast, a 1950s hostess trick, fruit that made kids laugh and adults nod. To modernize, it's a quirky combination, but to mid-century families, it was a conversation starter and a serving of fruit in one. Kids loved the look of it, adults appreciated the creativity, and it brought a burst of color to the table. The home ec booklets didn't shy away from fun, and candle salad was proof that presentation mattered as much as flavor. It was whimsical, unexpected, and a reminder that sometimes the silliest dishes are the ones we remember most. Sandwich loaf. If you've never seen one, imagine a loaf-shaped layer cake, but instead of sponge and frosting, it's bread and savory fillings. The Betty Crocker-era version, stacked layers of bread spread with mixtures of chicken salad, egg salad, or ham spread, then frosted with a smooth, creamy cheese mixture. Once chilled and sliced, each piece was a surprise of colors and flavors. While it showed up more often at luncheons, it wasn't unusual for leftover slices to appear at breakfast, especially after big gatherings. Leftover slices hit the breakfast table cold on toast. Company food, day 2. There was something almost ceremonial about slicing into it, a little gasp, a smile, and then the first bite where the cool creaminess met the soft bread. Tuna casserole with crushed crackers. Before cereal took over the pantry, a dish like this could anchor a whole morning. Tuna casserole with crushed crackers wasn't just lunch or dinner, it was a way to use what you had and make it feel special. The Betty Crocker-era version started with a creamy base. Milk, a can of tuna, maybe some peas if you had them, layered with cooked noodles. The crowning touch was a generous blanket of buttery, crushed saltine crackers that baked into a golden crust. Leftover casserole the next day was a breakfast workhorse, hearty enough for farm chores, comforting enough for a cold morning. It had that perfect combination of soft and crunchy, warm and salty that made you pause between bites. Squares re-crisped in a hot skillet for Saturday breakfast, chips back to crunch. In a time when waste wasn't an option, recipes like this stretched every penny and every ounce of effort, and somehow still felt like a treat. Mock chicken salad. Beyond breakfast ingenuity, this required no chicken at all. In leaner times, especially during rationing, the Betty Crocker-era mock chicken salad offered the illusion of abundance without the cost. The trick? Hard-boiled eggs, chopped finely, mixed with mayonnaise, diced celery, and just enough seasoning to suggest poultry's savory profile. Some versions even used a sprinkle of poultry seasoning to seal the illusion. Served on toast, crackers, or between soft slices of bread, it was a protein-rich start to the day that cost a fraction of the real thing. A Michigan reader recalled mothers loving it because it was quick, filling, and a clever way to keep a family satisfied when the budget was stretched thin. Tomato Aspic. When presentation led the menu, Tomato Aspic made modern cooks blink and ask, "They ate what in the morning?" But in the mid-20th century, this cool, savory gelatin made from seasoned tomato juice was a showstopper. Imagine a shimmering red mold, sliced into neat wedges, served alongside eggs or toast, bright, tangy, and unlike anything else on the table. More centerpiece than side, the BC-era booklets treated it as a way to bring color, freshness, and a touch of sophistication to the plate. The preparation itself felt like science and art combined. Tomato juice simmered with spices like celery salt, onion, and a hint of vinegar, then mixed with gelatin and poured into a decorative mold to chill overnight. The result was a firm yet tender set, easy to slice, but holding its shape perfectly. Celery salt and lemon nudged the air. B. Sierra booklets treated it like sculpture. For some families, tomato aspic was a holiday breakfast tradition, served with a dollop of mayonnaise or cottage cheese on the side. An older neighbor once told me how her mother would prepare it the night before Christmas morning, setting it on the back porch to chill in the winter air. "It made you feel like you were eating at a hotel," she laughed. Today, the idea of a tomato-based gelatin might seem strange, but back then it was a symbol of care and presentation, proof that even humble ingredients could be turned into something spectacular. Mock oyster stew. If there's one thing the Great Depression taught home cooks, it was how to fake the expensive stuff without losing dignity or flavor. Mock oyster stew was the Betty Crocker-era answer for families who wanted the elegance of seafood without the cost. The secret? Eggplant. Yes, diced eggplant, simmered until tender, taking on a silky texture and soaking up the creamy, buttery broth until it mimicked the bite of oysters surprisingly well. Eggplant did the textural heavy lifting. The broth did the convincing. A sprinkle of celery salt, a dash of white pepper, and the whole kitchen smelled like something that belonged on a fancy hotel menu. Back then, oyster stew was considered a treat, something you might have at Christmas or a special Sunday breakfast. But with oysters priced out of reach for many, this mock version kept the ritual alive. A Steeltown kitchen story goes like this. On paydays, Mother would make the real thing, if she could, but most weeks it was eggplant in the pot. "We never complained," she said, "because Mama served it with homemade biscuits, and the broth tasted like pure luxury." Prune whip sandwiches, breakfast in the Betty Crocker era, didn't shy away from sweet spreads. And prune whip sandwiches were a perfect example. Prunes were mashed and whipped with sugar until light and airy, creating a filling that was both sweet and rich in a way that stuck with you. Spread generously between slices of soft white bread, it was portable, filling, and just indulgent enough to feel like a treat. Prunes had a reputation as health food, especially for digestion, but this version turned them into something kids actually looked forward to. One family's ritual. School mornings, when Mother would wrap one of these sandwiches in wax paper for the lunchbox. She'd sneak a bite at breakfast before heading out the door, and that first taste of sweet, spiced prune filling would carry her through the chilly walk to class. "It tasted like dessert," she laughed, "but Mama called it vitamin breakfast." Prune whip was also frugal. Prunes were affordable, kept for ages, and could be rehydrated overnight. Cornflake-coated Spam Patties. For pure swagger at breakfast, cornflake-coated Spam Patties were bold, crispy, and a little bit rebellious, the kind of thing that made the kitchen smell like Saturday morning cartoons and a little mischief. Slices of Spam were dipped in beaten egg, dredged in crushed cornflakes, and fried until the coating was golden and audibly crunchy. Cornflakes crackled in the pan. Forks chased crumbs like confetti. The outside crackled under the fork, while the inside stayed salty, rich, and tender. Spam itself was a wartime and post-war hero, affordable, shelf-stable, and endlessly adaptable. But rolling it in cornflakes? That was pure mid-century creativity. Kids loved it because it felt like breakfast and lunch collided. Parents loved it because it used pantry staples and came together in minutes. Tuna-Potato chip casserole. Its small miracle was proving that the real magic of cooking wasn't in expensive ingredients. It was in turning the simplest things into something everyone wanted a second helping of. Tuna-Potato chip casserole wasn't just a meal, it was an event, especially when it showed up for breakfast the next day. The base was pure mid-century comfort. Tuna-Potato chip casserole wasn't just a meal, it was an event, especially when it showed up for breakfast the next day. The base was pure mid-century comfort. Tender egg noodles or macaroni folded into a creamy sauce made from a can of cream of mushroom soup, a splash of milk, and a can of tuna. The sauce clung to every noodle, rich and savory without being heavy. But the real thrill The reason kids would hover near the oven was the topping. A thick, generous layer of crushed potato chips scattered over the top, dotted with butter, and baked until the edges curled into golden, salty perfection. When you cracked into that crust with a fork, you got the satisfying crunch first, followed by the creamy, peppery warmth underneath. And here's where the breakfast connection came in. Mothers and grandmas didn't let leftovers go to waste. The next morning, they'd cut generous squares from the casserole dish, drop them into a hot skillet, and warm them until the chips crisped right back up. The smell alone, that blend of fried potato, buttery sauce, and briny tuna, could pull you out of bed faster than the sound of a school bell. A church cookbook note puts it this way: Saturday mornings, we'd all gather in the kitchen, still in our pajamas. Dad would have the skillet going, and we'd eat it standing around the counter, talking about what we were going to do that day. We never called it breakfast. It was just family. In a world before fast food, breakfast sandwiches, and drive-through coffee, this casserole was the kind of meal that made mornings feel unhurried. It was budget cooking, yes, but it was also a little reminder that flavor and love didn't cost extra. Hot Dog Crown Casserole. If there was ever a breakfast that could stop a kid in their tracks and make them run to the table, it was the Hot Dog Crown Casserole. Beyond just a meal, this was edible architecture, a dish designed to make you smile before you even took a bite. The presentation was half the magic. A perfect ring of plump hot dogs standing upright, end to end, around the edge of a deep baking dish. In the middle, a creamy, cloud-like mound of mashed potatoes, whipped smooth with butter and milk until they were as soft as a pillow. When this came out of the oven, the hot dogs stood tall and proud, their tops slightly blistered and caramelized from the heat, the mashed potatoes puffed up just enough to look invitingly soft. It was a dish that made breakfast feel like a celebration, even on an ordinary Tuesday morning. For kids, it was a visual feast. There was something almost cartoonish about it, like a set piece from a storybook where food was fun as well as filling. The flavor didn't disappoint. You'd slice off a piece with your fork, catching a section of juicy hot dog alongside a scoop of potatoes and maybe a little melted cheese if your mom was feeling generous that day. The saltiness of the frankfurter, the creaminess of the potatoes, the occasional crunch of a browned edge. It was simple food done in a way that made you feel cared for. A 1960s home ec teacher remembered how a father, a steel mill worker, would make this on his rare days off. He'd line up the hot dogs with the precision of a man used to working with machines, making sure the soldiers, as he called them, were perfectly spaced. The kids would sit at the table watching him work, laughing when one hot dog tipped over, and cheering when the finished casserole emerged from the oven like a crown fit for a king. We didn't have much, he told me, but that breakfast made us feel like we were eating something fancy. The mid-century genius was in understanding that presentation mattered. You could take two of the most ordinary ingredients, hot dogs and potatoes, and turn them into something that felt special just by arranging them differently. It looked like a joke until the first bite silenced the table. Today, you'd be hard-pressed to find a breakfast table with a centerpiece like this. But in the kitchens of the 50s and 60s, dishes like this were a reminder that love could be served in a circle of hot dogs and a pile of mashed potatoes. Hamburger Upside-Down Pie. For a little stagecraft at 7 a.m., there's a certain kind of magic in taking something familiar and serving it in a way no one expects. That was the charm of the Betty Crocker era Hamburger Upside-Down Pie. A dish that looked ordinary from the top but revealed a surprise the moment you cut into it. On the surface, it appeared to be a golden, fluffy pie, the kind of thing you'd expect to find on a dessert table. But flip a slice onto your plate, and instead of apples or berries, you'd find a rich layer of seasoned ground beef waiting underneath. The crust, made from biscuit or cornbread mix, baked right on top of the meat, sealing in all those savory juices. When it was inverted after baking, the crust became the base, and the beef mixture dotted with onions, maybe a little tomato sauce or ketchup, sat proudly on top like the main act it had been hiding all along. For breakfast, this was a revelation. Families didn't have time to start from scratch in the morning, but if Hamburger Upside-Down Pie had been made the night before, it transformed into a quick, filling first meal. Slices could be reheated in a skillet, or even eaten cold, the crust having absorbed the flavors overnight. The result was something heartier than toast, but more playful than a standard meat and potatoes plate. A neighbor recalled her mother making this every Saturday night, knowing there would be leftovers for Sunday morning. "We'd all dress for church, and Mom would serve it on the good plates," she said. "It was just hamburger and biscuit mix, but when you flipped it over, it felt like we were eating something fancy. We called it backwards pie, and my dad always pretended he didn't know which side to eat first." The beauty of the dish was how it invited interaction. Flipping food upside down was a novelty, and it turned breakfast into an experience. Even kids who might have turned up their noses at a plate of ground beef would happily dig in just for the fun of the reveal. The pamphlets knew that food wasn't just about taste. It was about moments, rituals, and a little bit of theater at the table. Today, the upside-down method is mostly reserved for pineapple cakes or tarts, but this savory version was a clever reminder that you could bend the rules and still end up with something delicious. Bologna peanut butter roll-ups. If you ever needed proof that mid-century America had no fear of unusual flavor combinations, the Bologna peanut butter roll-up is Exhibit A. Today, the thought might make people raise an eyebrow, but back in the Betty Crocker era heyday, this was a lunchbox favorite that sometimes found its way to the breakfast table, especially in homes where quick filling options were king. The concept was as simple as it was surprising. Take a thin slice of bologna, spread a thin but even layer of creamy peanut butter across its surface, then roll it up tightly like a cigar. Some folks added a pickle spear in the middle for an extra tangy crunch. Others simply tucked the roll into a paper napkin and handed it off as a grab-and-go breakfast. It was salty, sweet, savory, and a little nutty, and for kids who grew up eating them, it was as normal as cereal. One Sandlot team called them Lucky Rolls, salty, sweet, gone by first pitch. The mid-century pamphlets often celebrated this kind of practicality. Bologna was inexpensive, kept well in the fridge, and didn't require cooking. Peanut butter was equally thrifty and offered a protein boost that kept you full until lunch. Together, they made a kind of Depression-era power snack that was still holding strong in the 1950s and 60s. And for all the jokes you might hear today, there's no denying the texture contrast was satisfying. The smooth, creamy peanut butter clinging to the slick, salty bologna, with just enough chew to make it feel like more than a snack. It was portable, no mess, and easy for even young kids to assemble themselves. A rarity in an era when most meals were prepared entirely by adults. Now, you'll hardly ever see it on a breakfast table, and even fewer people will admit they liked it. But the ones who do, they smile when they talk about it because it's a memory of a time when food didn't have to make sense to be good. Macaroni and prunes bake. At first glance, it sounds like a kitchen accident, like someone meant to make pasta for dinner and fruit compote for dessert, and somehow they ended up in the same dish. But for a certain generation of Americans, macaroni and prunes bake was no mistake at all. It was a purposeful, thoughtful, and yes, delicious breakfast that reflected the ingenuity of the Depression era, the thrift of the post-war years, and the cozy comfort of a home-cooked meal. To understand why this dish existed, you have to remember the mindset of the time. In the 1930s through the 1950s, food wasn't just about flavor, it was about fuel, affordability, and making the most of what you had. Prunes were a quiet superstar, inexpensive compared to fresh fruit, long-lasting in the pantry, naturally sweet and nutrient-rich. Macaroni was the other half of the equation, filling, versatile, and a budget cook's best friend. The dish came together simply. Elbow macaroni was boiled until tender, then folded with chopped juicy prunes. A custard of eggs, milk, and sugar was poured over, binding everything together. Sometimes a pinch of cinnamon or nutmeg was added, giving it a warm, spiced aroma that filled the kitchen. Out of the oven, it emerged with a golden, slightly glossy crust, hiding a soft, creamy interior where prunes had melted into jammy pockets. A spoon cracked the caramelized top. Inside was custard soft and sundae quiet. Eating it was a curious delight. Familiar pasta texture, silky custard, and a flavor somewhere between bread pudding and French toast. The sweetness was balanced, never overwhelming, and for kids, finding those syrupy bites of prune was the best part. Eleanor, a woman from rural Iowa, told me this was the most comforting breakfast of her childhood. "Mama made it on winter Sundays," she recalled. "We'd come in from feeding the chickens, our boots heavy with snow, and the kitchen would smell like sugar and milk. We'd each get a steaming square, and it felt like we were being spoiled. Only later did I realize it was one of the cheapest things she could make." What made it sing wasn't just rural appeal in some post-war suburbs. It appeared as a company breakfast, plated neatly with a dollop of whipped cream. The home ec booklets promoted it as hearty and economical, but it could be dressed up for guests. Variations included swapping prunes for dried apricots or raisins, or sprinkling crushed cornflakes, breadcrumbs, or sugar on top for a caramelized crust. Today, it's hard to imagine this on a modern breakfast table, but in its time it was a point of pride, a way to create comfort from pantry odds and ends. For those who remember, the memory isn't just about flavor. It's the clink of forks on ceramic plates, steam on frosted windows, the hum of the oven, and the quiet satisfaction of starting the day with something that stuck with you until noon. Banana mayonnaise salad. Some dishes from the Betty Crocker era were so unexpected that modern diners can hardly believe they existed. Banana mayonnaise salad was one of them, a combination that might make today's taste buds hesitate, but in mid-20th century kitchens, it was considered clever, colorful, and even company-worthy. The setup was simple, yet theatrical. Picture a crisp bed of iceberg lettuce, pale green and fresh from the icebox. On top sat peeled bananas, either halved or whole, their yellow skins removed to reveal smooth curves that glistened from a quick rinse. Then came the flourish, a generous dollop of mayonnaise, sometimes sweetened or thinned with a splash of cream, spooned over the top. It might be crowned with chopped nuts, shredded cheese, or a bright maraschino cherry. Against the green lettuce, the yellow banana and white mayo created a plate that looked like something from a glossy 1950s magazine. Magazine pretty, church social, honest, a mid-century flavor math that still adds up for some. In the post-war years, dishes like this were praised for their practicality as much as their presentation. Bananas were affordable, kept reasonably well, and felt just exotic enough to be special. Mayonnaise was a pantry staple with crossover appeal, equally at home in savory salads and sweet fruit pairings. Serving fruit with creamy dressing wasn't strange then. It signaled thought and effort in menu planning. Ruth, who grew up in Kansas in the 1950s, recalled her mother making this salad every Easter morning. "It looked so pretty you almost didn't want to touch it," she said. "But my father would spear a banana, chop it with the lettuce, and mix it so the mayo coated everything. We kids copied him, and it became our breakfast tradition." For most families, banana mayonnaise salad wasn't everyday fare, but a way to make breakfast feel festive. It showed up at Sunday brunches, church potlucks, and holiday tables alongside deviled eggs, Jell-O, molds, and slices of sweet bread. The combination of creamy, tangy mayo with the mellow sweetness of banana was surprisingly pleasant. like a fruit and cream pairing with a savory twist. The textures added to the appeal: soft banana meeting cool, velvety mayonnaise, with crisp lettuce underneath for crunch. Chopped nuts brought another layer, breaking through the creaminess. Some cooks swapped mayonnaise for Miracle Whip to add sweetness, while others mixed in lemon juice for brightness. In its time, the dish carried a certain aspirational air. Fresh bananas year-round were still a luxury for many, and presenting them on a platter with lettuce and mayo elevated them into something worthy of an occasion. Today, banana mayonnaise salad has all but disappeared, often remembered as a retro oddity. But for those who grew up with it, it's tied to family gatherings, special mornings, and an era when kitchen creativity meant making the most of what you had and presenting it with pride. Pickle-stuffed meatloaf. At first glance, this looked like your standard stick-to-your-ribs meatloaf, a humble loaf of seasoned ground beef, shaped by hand and baked until the kitchen smelled like pure comfort. But slice it open, and there it was, a bright green pickle running through the middle, like a little treasure hidden in plain sight. Its quiet genius struck the perfect balance of thrift, practicality, and presentation. Ground beef was the backbone of countless mid-century meals, affordable, filling, and endlessly adaptable. By tucking a tangy dill pickle or a few crisp spears into the center before baking, home cooks turned something ordinary into a dish that could spark conversation. Each slice revealed a ring of tender beef surrounding that pop of green, promising a burst of flavor in every bite. Cooking softened the pickle slightly, taming its sharp tang while keeping a pleasant crunch. The juices mingled with the beef, adding a bright note that cut through the richness. Cold slices sizzled in bacon fat. The pickle warmed and popped. Harold, who grew up in Chicago in the late 1950s, remembered it as a Friday night staple in his home. His mother, a sewing factory worker, made it knowing there'd be leftovers for Saturday breakfast. She'd slice it cold in the morning, he said, and fry the pieces in bacon grease until the edges crisped. The pickle in the middle would warm again, almost juicy. We'd eat it with eggs and toast. It was the perfect start to the weekend. For kids, the fun was in the surprise. Sometimes your slice had a big hunk of pickle, sometimes just a sliver, and getting the perfect slice felt like winning the breakfast lottery. Adults liked the balance of flavors, especially in an era when many breakfast meats leaned heavy. The pickle's acidity made the dish feel lighter, even alongside fried potatoes or biscuits. Families often swore by their preferred pickle: dill for tang, sweet gherkins for a softer bite, or spicy pickles for a little kick. The meatloaf itself followed the standard formula: beef, breadcrumbs, eggs, onions, and milk, but the pickle made each version personal. Presentation was part of the charm. You didn't just hack into it, you sliced it carefully, so everyone could see the surprise inside. There'd be little gasps, laughter, even playful bargaining over who got the most centered slice. Today, pickle-stuffed meatloaf has almost vanished from home kitchens, but for those who remember, the taste brings back more than flavor. It's the sound of a knife through a crust, the aroma of beef and onion, and that flash of green in the middle. A burst of joy tucked inside an everyday meal. Cabbage and noodles with bacon grease. Some breakfasts weren't about dainty plates or pretty presentation. They were about fuel, hearty, lasting fuel, for people who had a long day ahead. In the Betty Crocker era, few dishes delivered that better than cabbage and noodles with bacon grease. What made it sing was its simplicity, but that was its strength. Thinly sliced cabbage went into a skillet with a generous spoonful of bacon grease, the liquid gold saved from every fry-up and stored in a jar by the stove. Cabbage hit hot fat, sweet, smoky, winter morning perfume. As it hit the heat, the cabbage hissed and sizzled, softening slowly while soaking up that smoky, salty flavor. Meanwhile, egg noodles boiled in a nearby pot, the steam fogging the kitchen windows. Once drained, They were tossed into the skillet with the cabbage, the hot pan coating them in a shimmering glaze of bacon fat. A sprinkle of salt and pepper was all it needed. No frills, no fuss. For many farming and mining families, this wasn't just breakfast. It was morning fuel to keep you going through fields, tunnels, or factory floors. Margaret, whose father worked in the Pennsylvania coal mines, remembered him eating a plate before work. He swore it kept him warm in the tunnels, she said. If we were lucky, we'd get a fried egg on top, but even without it, it filled you till lunchtime. Bacon grease was more than flavor. It was thrift. In an era when nothing was wasted, every drop was saved to season vegetables, fry potatoes, or, as here, turn cabbage and noodles into something deeply satisfying. This kind of kitchen economy defined the mid-century table, stretching ingredients, layering flavor, and making the most of what you had. Some families added their own touches: caraway seeds for an old-world taste, vinegar for brightness, or leftover bacon for extra bite. But the heart of the dish stayed the same for decades because it didn't need changing. In the home ec booklets, cabbage and noodles often appeared as a side dish, but in many homes it took center stage, served in heavy ceramic bowls, steam curling up into the cool morning air. It was a meal you ate slowly, savoring the salt, smoke, and sweetness of the cabbage, and at the bottom of the bowl, a sheen of bacon. Grease reminded you exactly where all that flavor had come from. Vinegar Cobbler. Of all the inventive recipes to come from America's thriftiest kitchens, Vinegar Cobbler might be the most surprising. A cobbler without fruit? It sounds impossible, but in times when fresh or canned fruit was scarce or too costly, home cooks found a way to deliver that same sweet tart satisfaction using only pantry staples. A pantry cobbler the pamphlets called make do. The crust said otherwise. The secret was vinegar, mixed with sugar and water, then baked beneath a tender crust. It created the illusion of a fruit filling, something between apple pie and rhubarb crisp. Beyond just tricking the palate, it was about giving families the joy of dessert, or even breakfast, when the real thing wasn't available. The process was simple. A biscuit or pastry dough was placed into a baking dish, topped with a syrup made from vinegar, sugar, and water, sometimes spiced with cinnamon or nutmeg. As it baked, the syrup bubbled, soaking into the crust and caramelizing at the edges. The aroma, sweet, warm, and familiar, could draw everyone into the kitchen. And yes, this was breakfast fare. In lean decades, a slice of something sweet in the morning wasn't indulgence. It was a morale boost. Served with milk or coffee, Vinegar Cobbler reminded families that even in hard times, small comforts could be made from almost nothing. Lillian, who grew up in Oklahoma during the tail end of the Dust Bowl, recalled thinking it was peach cobbler until she was 12. "Mama made it every Sunday morning," she said. "We'd eat it warm with cream if we had it. It fooled us completely, and it tasted like love." The genius of Vinegar Cobbler was its thrift and adaptability. A bottle of vinegar meant for pickles could become the centerpiece of a meal. The tang balanced the sugar, preventing it from being overly sweet, and the recipe could be made in any season. Some communities served it well into the 1960s alongside biscuits, sausage gravy, and coffee. Today, Vinegar Cobbler has nearly vanished, living on mostly in vintage cookbooks. Modern diners might call it fake pie, but for those who remember, it recalls the hum of the oven, sunlight on a chipped kitchen table, and the simple truth that a warm slice of something, even without fruit, could make you feel rich. Dried beef cheese ball. Some mid-century recipes were so versatile they could appear anywhere, at breakfast, brunch, or on a party buffet. The dried beef cheese ball was one of those, a special occasion dish that didn't require special occasion spending. Its base was cream cheese, beaten until smooth and rich. Into it went finely chopped dried beef, the kind sold in little glass jars or vacuum packs, salty, savory, and full of concentrated flavor. Some cooks added green onions for bite or a splash of Worcestershire sauce for depth. Shaped into a ball or log, rolled in more chopped beef, or sometimes nuts, and chilled until firm, it was ready to slice or spread. When placed on the table, it transformed into a centerpiece. More centerpiece than snack, the salty beef balanced the cheese's tang perfectly, and every bite had that satisfying chew. It could be scooped onto crackers, spread on toast, or tucked inside a halved bagel. In many homes, it doubled as breakfast the morning after a party. Next morning, it reappeared on toast, party still going, just quieter. Susan, who grew up in Michigan in the 1960s, remembered Christmas mornings when her family toasted thick bread, spread it with leftover cheese ball, and called it holiday breakfast. It felt indulgent, she said, like the celebration wasn't over yet. It was also wonderfully practical. Dried beef kept well in the pantry, cream cheese was affordable year-round, and the whole dish could be made in under 15 minutes. The pamphlets often suggested it as a do-ahead recipe, ideal for a breakfast spread that needed to impress without last-minute stress. For many kids, it was an introduction to grown-up flavors, the salty meat, the creamy cheese, the tang of onion or Worcestershire. Paired with buttery crackers, it became a taste memory that lingered for decades. Making it could even be a small ritual. Some families rolled theirs in parsley for color, others in paprika for a warm look. Creative hosts shaped them into wreaths at Christmas or footballs for game day, turning the cheese ball into edible decor. Today, the dried beef version is rare, replaced by store-bought spreads and dips. But for those who remember, it's more than a flavor. It's a snapshot of laughter in the kitchen, of spreading something special while leaning on the counter, of mornings when the party hadn't quite ended yet. Prune whip pancakes. If you grew up in the Betty Crocker era, you knew pancakes could be more than just butter and syrup. Prune whip. Pancakes were proof of that, a breakfast that felt like dessert without ever tipping into pure indulgence. They were born out of two staples in many mid-century kitchens, fluffy homemade pancakes and prune whip, a sweet, airy topping made by whipping cooked prunes with sugar and egg whites until they became light as clouds. The pancakes themselves were standard fare, tender, golden rounds, cooked on a hot griddle, each one with that slightly crisp edge from a pan greased with bacon fat or butter. But the magic happened when you replaced maple syrup with a generous dollop of prune whip. The topping brought a rich, jammy sweetness that was deeper and more complex than fruit syrup, and the whipped egg whites gave it a texture that felt luxurious. Whip slumped into the hot cake with a soft hush. For families, it was a way to stretch an affordable ingredient into something special. Prunes kept well in the pantry, and turning them into a whipped topping meant you could make something that looked and felt celebratory, without spending extra on fresh fruit or imported jams. Kids didn't always realize what they were eating. Many just thought it was a kind of chocolate-free mousse, but they knew it was good. A neighbor recalled a man named George who remembered his mother making prune whip pancakes every year on his birthday morning. She'd stack them high, he said, and put a little swirl of the whip on each one, so by the time you got to the top, it was almost like eating a cake. It made the whole day feel special. The home ec booklets often promoted recipes like this as dual purpose, something that could be a weekday breakfast or a Sunday treat, depending on how you dressed it up. A sprinkle of powdered sugar, a few chopped nuts, or even a thin drizzle of cream could elevate it from a simple family meal to a dish worthy of guests. Today, prune whip has largely disappeared from the average kitchen, replaced by whipped cream, yogurt, or fruit compotes. But for those who remember it, the pairing with pancakes is hard to forget. The way the airy whip melted slightly on the hot cakes, the scent of warm prunes mingling with the smell of fresh pancakes, the feeling of eating something both thrifty and indulgent. Bacon banana fritters. Some recipes make perfect sense when you see them on paper, and others only make sense once you've tasted them. Bacon banana fritters fall firmly into that second category. On the surface, it sounds like a dare. Sweet, ripe bananas combined with smoky, salty bacon, battered and fried. But in the kitchens of mid-century America, this was an inspired way to use two breakfast favorites in one bite. The fritters began with a simple batter: flour, eggs, a little baking powder for lift, and milk to bring it together. Bananas were mashed into the mix for sweetness, and crisp bacon bits were folded in for depth and contrast. Spoonfuls of the batter were dropped into hot fat, sizzling until golden brown and puffed. The result was a fritter with a tender, almost cake-like interior, bursts of sweet banana, and little pockets of smoky bacon in every bite. For families, this was a dish that felt both playful and indulgent. You didn't have to choose between a sweet breakfast or a savory one. You got both, wrapped in a crispy golden shell. Powdered sugar or maple, either way, the grin arrived first. Some cooks dusted them with powdered sugar, while others served them with a drizzle of maple syrup to bridge the flavors even more. A church cookbook note puts it this way: her mother would make bacon banana fritters on Saturday mornings, piling them high in the center of the table. We'd sit there in our pajamas, grabbing them as fast as she could fry them, Louise said. You never got the same bite twice. Sometimes you hit a big piece of banana, sometimes a chunk of bacon. It was like breakfast roulette. The mid-century version leaned into versatility. The recipe worked just as well with plantains for a more tropical twist, or with a little cinnamon in the batter for warmth. And because bananas and bacon were both common staples, it didn't require a special trip to the store, a big advantage for busy households. Today, bacon banana fritters have largely faded from home kitchens, replaced by more predictable sweet and savory pairings. But for those who grew up eating them, the memory is vivid. The smell of frying batter, the laughter around the table, and the guilty pleasure of licking syrup from your fingers after the last bite. Cornmeal mush with maple drizzle. Cornmeal mush was one of those breakfasts that didn't need frills to win people over. It was simple, hearty, and deeply tied to a time when stretching a bag of cornmeal was a badge of kitchen skill. The Betty Crocker-era take elevated it just enough to make it feel like a treat, especially when served with a drizzle of real maple syrup. The process started the night before in many households. Cornmeal was slowly whisked into boiling water with a pinch of salt, stirred until it thickened into a smooth golden porridge. It could be eaten hot right then, but the real magic happened when it was poured into a loaf pan, chilled overnight until it set firm. In the morning, the solid loaf was sliced into thick slabs, fried in a skillet until each side was golden and crispy on the outside, but still soft and creamy in the middle. That's when the maple drizzle came in. Warm syrup, often heated gently on the stove, was poured over the hot slices so it seeped into every crispy edge. Edges stayed crunch-sharp. The middle went custard soft under warm syrup. The first bite gave you a satisfying crunch, followed by the smooth, comforting texture inside. A contrast that kept you going back for forkful after forkful. For many families, this wasn't just a budget meal, it was tradition. An older neighbor told me about a man from Vermont who swore cornmeal mush with maple drizzle was better than any fancy pancake. His grandmother would make it on winter mornings, the smell of frying cornmeal filling the kitchen while snow piled up outside. It was the kind of breakfast that made you feel ready to go shovel the whole driveway, he laughed. The pamphlets often leaned on cornmeal for its affordability and versatility, and this dish was a perfect example of turning something humble into something memorable. It could be savory, topped with gravy or bacon, but the maple syrup version made it feel almost indulgent, even though the ingredients cost pennies. Today, cornmeal mush has been overshadowed by polenta in restaurants and forgotten in many home kitchens. But for those who remember, one forkful of that crispy, syrup-soaked slice can still bring back the clink of forks on heavy plates, the warmth of the stove on a cold morning, and the quiet satisfaction of starting the day with something both frugal and delicious. Cornmeal mush was one of those breakfasts that didn't need frills to win people over. It was simple, hearty, and deeply tied to a time when stretching a bag of cornmeal was a badge of kitchen skill. Sausage apple ring. The sausage apple ring was one of those creations that looked as good as it tasted, a true centerpiece breakfast designed to impress without overwhelming the cook. It combined two flavors that have been paired for centuries: sweet, juicy apples and savory, spiced sausage, but arranged them in a way that turned an ordinary morning into an occasion. The process began by shaping sausage into small patties or links, cooking them just enough to develop that rich browned crust and let the kitchen fill with their savory aroma. Meanwhile, apples, often tart varieties like Granny Smith or Jonathan, were peeled, cored, and sliced into thick rings. The apples were quickly sautéed in a little butter and brown sugar until their edges softened and the sugar formed a glossy glaze. Then came the assembly. In a round baking dish, or bundt pan, the sausage and apple slices were alternated in a circle, each piece leaning against the next, creating a beautiful pattern of golden fruit and browned meat. Once baked together for a short time, the flavors mingled, the sausage lending its spice and richness to the apples, and the apples giving the sausage a sweet, tangy lift. Browned sausage and apple glaze braided in the oven air. For many families, this dish was reserved for holidays, Sunday brunch, or mornings when company was staying over. A 1960s home ec teacher remembered a woman named Clara who remembered her mother making sausage apple rings every Thanksgiving morning. "We'd eat it before the turkey even went in the oven," she said. "The smell was so incredible it almost outshined the whole holiday meal." The beauty of the recipe was its balance. The sausage satisfied the savory cravings, the apples lightened the plate, and the presentation made it feel like something from a hotel breakfast table. And because both components could be prepped ahead, it was a stress-free way to put something showy on the table early in the day. Some cooks added their own flourishes, a sprinkle of sage leaves between the layers, or a drizzle of maple syrup that caramelized during the final minutes of baking. The dish had a theatrical quality that children especially loved, watching their mother arrange each piece with the precision of an artist creating an edible wreath. The anticipation built as the ring baked, filling the house with competing aromas of sweet caramelized apples and rich seasoned pork. When it emerged from the oven, there was always a moment of admiration before anyone dared to disturb the perfect pattern with serving spoons. The pamphlets often showcased this dish as a versatile crowd pleaser, perfect for pairing with eggs, pancakes, or even a simple loaf of sweet bread. It was hearty enough to stand on its own, yet refined enough to serve to guests without feeling too rustic. Today, the sausage-apple pairing is still popular, but the ring presentation has quietly faded from home kitchens. For those who remember it, though, the image of that perfectly arranged circle, glistening apples nestled against savory sausage, is a reminder that breakfast can be both beautiful and deeply satisfying. Grapefruit brulee. In the mid-century kitchen, even something as simple as a halved grapefruit could be turned into a breakfast that felt refined. Grapefruit brulee was a perfect example. a dish that transformed a common piece of fruit into something worthy of silver spoons and special mornings. The preparation was straightforward, but the effect was dramatic. The grapefruit was cut cleanly in half, its segments loosened with a small serrated knife so each bite could be scooped out easily. A sprinkle of sugar, sometimes brown, sometimes white, was spread evenly across the surface. Then came the magic. The sugared grapefruit was placed under a broiler or held beneath the intense flame of a kitchen torch until the sugar melted, bubbled, and hardened into a thin golden crust. Spoons tapped, crack, then citrus steam. That first crack with the spoon was as satisfying as the taste. Beneath the caramelized surface, the grapefruit's bright, tart juice was warmed just enough to release its aroma. The bitterness of the fruit and the sweetness of the caramel played against each other perfectly, making every bite feel fresh, bright, and just indulgent enough for breakfast. For many, this dish was tied to special occasions. An older neighbor recalled a man named Arthur who remembered his mother making grapefruit brulee every Easter morning. "She'd bring them to the table on her best china," he said. "We'd tap the tops with our spoons and watch the sugar shatter. It felt like dessert before church." The pamphlets presented the recipe as a way to dress up a healthy breakfast, and it worked beautifully. Grapefruit was affordable and available year-round, but with the brulee treatment, it became a statement dish, one that could be served on its own or alongside something heartier like eggs and toast. The technique itself became a small performance. Mothers would often let children watch from a safe distance as the broiler door opened, releasing waves of caramelized heat into the kitchen air. Some families developed their own variations, a pinch of cinnamon mixed with the sugar, or a few drops of vanilla extract brushed onto the fruit before the final broiling. The beauty was in its simplicity and transformative power, turning winter's most reliable citrus into something that felt festive and special. Part of its charm was the ritual of it. Scooping out each segment felt deliberate, unhurried, the kind of breakfast you lingered over instead of rushing through. In a time when mornings were often busy, taking a few extra minutes to caramelize sugar over fruit felt almost luxurious. Today, you might see grapefruit brulee on a brunch menu in a trendy cafe, but for those who grew up with it at home, it's not about style. It's about the memory of the warm glow from the broiler, the smell of caramelizing sugar, and the quiet joy of starting the day with something beautiful and bright. Oatmeal soufflé. Oatmeal has always been a breakfast workhorse, simple, hearty, and dependable. But in the Betty Crocker era, even oatmeal got the chance to be dressed up for the spotlight. Enter the oatmeal soufflé, a dish that took the humble morning porridge and transformed it into something airy, elegant, and completely unexpected. It started the same way most soufflés did, with a base. In this case, the base was a creamy, lightly sweetened oatmeal cooked until smooth and thick. Eggs were separated, the yolks whisked into the warm oatmeal to enrich it, while the whites were beaten into stiff peaks until they held their shape. The whites were then gently folded into the oatmeal, creating a batter so light it almost seemed to float. Poured into buttered ramekins or a single baking dish, the mixture went into the oven, where the heat coaxed it upward into a golden crown. The edges browned delicately, while the inside stayed soft, moist, and subtly flavored with cinnamon, nutmeg, or vanilla. When it emerged, it was a thing of beauty, tall, puffed, and steaming, a far cry from the dense oatmeal most people were used to. This was the kind of breakfast that made people sit up a little straighter at the table. A cousin's story goes like this. Her grandmother made oatmeal soufflé every time she stayed over. She'd bring it to the table in this big, puffy dish and tell us to eat quick before it fell, Elaine said. We always felt like we were eating something fancy, even though it was just oats and eggs. The mid-century version leaned into versatility. It could be served plain with a dusting of powdered sugar, drizzled with maple syrup for sweetness, or topped with fresh fruit if the season allowed. For more indulgent mornings, some cooks spooned over a warm custard sauce, turning it into a breakfast dessert hybrid that made children and adults equally happy. Part of its charm was that fleeting quality soufflés are famous for, the way they hold their proud height for just a few minutes before slowly settling. That little bit of urgency made eating it feel special. It asked to be eaten fast. That was half the charm. It wasn't the kind of breakfast you left on the table while you got ready for the day. It was one you sat down for, savoring while it was still at its peak. Today, oatmeal soufflé is almost entirely absent from American breakfast tables, replaced by quick oats in the microwave or overnight jars in the fridge. But for those who grew up with it, the memory lingers, the gentle sweetness, the light-as-air texture, the golden top breaking under the spoon to reveal warm, tender oats inside. It's a fitting end to a list of breakfasts that prove something important. In the Betty Crocker era, even the simplest ingredients could become extraordinary with a little care, a little creativity, and a willingness to make breakfast more than just the first meal of the day. From golden egg sauces to playful fruit salads, from humble pantry staples to dishes that felt like little celebrations, these breakfasts weren't just about feeding the day. They were about feeding memories. Maybe you grew up with some of these, or maybe you've just discovered a few worth bringing back. Either way, they remind us that the best meals aren't always the fanciest. They're the ones we remember.